globe, an author of 3 books, most notably the namesake of this show, Be Iconic. Dr. Harry is passionate about helping women to live and love themselves as they age gracefully. Welcome to the show, Dr. Harry.
Hi, be back.
So good to see you. Today, we're really going to talk about something that I think so many women struggle with. Our plates are overflowing. And even as we've entered into this pandemic, I think a lot of people went into it thinking, oh my gosh, I have so many projects I can tackle. I can breathe. I don't have to commute. But the reality is that in true fashion, we have all added more to our plates. And so with that additional time, it's been replaced with other projects, maybe more time on the phone, and the stress hasn't let up. And so today we want to talk a little bit about that effect that stress has on your brain health. So Dr. Harry, I have to ask you, number one, when you think about someone who comes to you and is battling with a number of chronic issues that have to do with stress, what do you immediately think when you start to think about just the longevity and the brain function and the effect of on their brains?
Well, here's the thing. We know, and we don't need studies, but we do have them that really points out to us that stress can really have a negative impact on brain function. And when we're talking about brain function, let's talk about things that we can relate to. So we're talking about things like memory, our ability to recall things, our ability to think clearly and precisely, our ability to problem solve, to think things through. It has an impact on all of those things. And most importantly, over the long term, chronic stress that's not being managed well can actually increase our risk for things like dementia, not to mention the just crazy things it does to our body. But our brain is really very susceptible to the changes of stress.
So, I was reading up on this as well when you started talking about this is something you really wanted to discuss. And there are a number of surprising ways that stress affects your brain. The question is that when we think about those negative effects, contributing to mental illness is one that's at the top of the list as well. Can you talk a little bit about that and how someone can figure out if they're signaling towards something that's unhealthy for them and maybe that they need some additional help?
Well, here's the thing. What stress does, right? It kind of activates that survival mode for us. So we were in that fight or flight mode continually. And so that's what chronic stress can do to us. So when that happens, inflammation in our body increases. And you're like, we're talking about the brain. But I was like, listen, inflammation increases everywhere. And what we do know is that inflammation and all the chemicals that come with that has such a negative impact on the brain. It actually contributes to things like you wouldn't think about, like depression, anxiety. All of those things can be fueled by inflammation. So it's so important that any part of any kind of mental health strategy really needs to involve stress management, because stress in and of itself, it changes the hormones and the way the hormones interact with the brain. It actually starts whittling away or at that memory center in the brain, the hippocampus. So think of stress this way. So when we go into that hyper survival mode, right? So that part of the brain, that emotional part of the brain, the amygdala, that's the one that runs the show, because ultimately it's faster at responding. Because if we're trying to survive, we need quick responses. So if we're constantly living there, then the intellectual part of the brain, the part of the brain that says to us, hey, let's think this through, let's reason with this. The part of the brain that actually helps us to think more clearly and brings clarity in, that part of the brain does not get worked out. Think of it this way. It's like, I know I see a lot of people, and I won't say any sexes, but some people, when they work out, they work one particular part of their body, right? So they either work out like the upper body, so they have amazing like arms, and you see all this definition in the abs, and then you get to the legs, and they're like little spindly sticks because they don't work on them. So it's kind of the same thing in the brain. If you're really under chronic stress, the part of the brain that's always running the show all the time now is that emotional part of the brain. So now you're starting to actually rewire the brain. And so what's happening now, that part of the brain that comes in with the clarity and thinking clearly and all of that sort of stuff, that part doesn't get exercised. And so you start gradually just losing the ability to do that over time.
Yeah, and it's especially, I was also reading that stress can actually change the brain structure, which is interesting because a number of researchers from the University of California, Berkeley revealed that chronic stress can lead to long-term changes in brain function. So when you talked about a little bit about memory and so forth, but there's also a part of overproduction of a lot of other different things, and I won't go into the technical because I don't know them, so I'm sure everyone else doesn't want me to speak on them. But can you talk a little bit about kind of the changes in the brain structure and what, because obviously we all can respond to what we see. But I think it's those things that a lot of us don't see of how stress is really affecting our brain that really could be almost the silent issues, right? Of a number of different things. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Well, like we were talking about, it actually, the parts of the brain that's responsible for memory and short-term memory and memory recollection, the hippocampus, it shrinks when you're stressed too much because you have high stress hormonal levels like cortisol, and it shrinks that part of the brain. The part of the brain that's responsible for thinking clearly, that doesn't get used as much. And so you're not able to think very clearly with that. And so what you're doing is you're actually starting to rewire the way the brain works and thinks. So you're kind of stuck in that place for now it becomes really, really difficult for you to get out of that place because now you've rewired the way the brain works. When you're overly stressed and then you start not sleeping well, and studies tell us that that starts building up all sort of toxic things in the brain, and a particular protein that we know has been linked to things like dementia gets accumulated in the brain. So you're really doing significant damage in the brain when you are under chronic stress. And yes, I know there are stresses out there, and there are a lot of things, especially right now, we know that we cannot change. So what we are finding out that the worst kind of stress is the one that's just so unpredictable and random, and it just seems like it just comes at you at like random times, and so you can't prepare and you can't anticipate for it. That's why it's so important that we start focusing on things that we can have control over, because then that starts reorganizing the brain again and starts bringing in that cognitive part of the brain, and instead of letting stress just completely hijack and run the show.
So, we always joke, I've heard, and I know I used to say it even in my teens about a certain activity or reading too long was killing my brain cells. And so I don't know that any of us really understand what that means. It just sounds good, right? So when you think about this, though, there is significant research that says that, stress does kill brain cells. What does that mean to someone? Like when you say that, what should they be looking out for? What does that mean as far as cascading effects?
Well, what you will notice is that whole where I put my keys thing become really like present now. If you're actually under a lot of stress and you start experiencing you're not seeing your brain cells die, right? But sometimes it's almost like you can feel them die off because you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I don't remember, or, just something that was obviously easy for me to remember. I don't remember that. I can't remember how to do this, or it really does that. And so communication between the brain cells gets significantly impacted. And it also changes all of those neurochemicals in the brain. It can make them, drop like your serotonin levels. All of those things can get impacted when stress becomes too much. So not only are you reducing the amount of cells that the brain has, and on a scan, it looks like, atrophy or shrinkage is basically what it looks like. If we're not going in there and counting the neurons, what we're looking at is, how it looks. Does it look smaller than the average person your age. And so that's it. That's really what it means. It's like if you take a bunch of 50-year-olds, the average normal 50-year-old has a certain size brain, and is yours bigger or smaller? So things that we know that can impact that is stress, and in a positive way is as exercise. As exercise has actually been shown to help us build brain cells, believe it or not. So stress management is really important here.
So you just mentioned something, because that was actually my next question. So I want to unpack that a little bit. When they say that stress shrinks the brain, so I, have a really good mentor of mine who, over the years, everyone talks about how just years of running a high powered business, and but it was nonstop. It was 24 hours, and subsequently, the person dealt with dementia later in life. And, I just know a lot of individuals were looking at that and talking about how the stress levels, just the not sleeping and all of that, that was the assumption that all of that led to the person kind of suffering through that towards the later in life. So when you say shrinks the brain, is that part of what you're saying about the cascading effects and mental disorders and amnesia, dementia and all of those things? Or is there something else that we should be looking at as well?
Well, it's the whole gamut. I mean, so we're talking about anxiety, depression. We're talking about might be earlier onset dementia. Now it's difficult. It'll be really difficult to take one person and say absolutely that is what caused dementia, but I am sure that it contributed significantly, because studies are telling us that the not only stress but the behaviors that accompanies stress. Sometimes, we make poor choices with food. We don't sleep very well. We find other habits that are not really so great for us in order to be able to manage the stress. So we have to find beneficial ways of coping with stress is the key thing. So not all stress is bad. We all need a certain amount of stress to kind of help us be focused and on task. But when it becomes excessive or it outweighs what the body can meet, that's when it becomes a problem. When it's chronic and unrelenting with no space for rejuvenation, that's when it becomes a problem. When it makes you constantly feel like you have no control. This is a big one, especially with job stressors. The people who have the most stress in their jobs are those who feel that they have the least control over what's happening. And so when you feel helpless and you feel that there's nothing that you control, that's when it has the most negative impact, not just on the brain, but on the body as well. So, the brain shrinking there could be many causes for that, but we have done some studies, researchers, not me personally, but researchers have done studies that, that shows certain parts of the brain does get smaller when people are under significant amount of stress. They've done studies that show that people don't think clearly, and their memory is really not as good when they're under significant amount of stress. So over time, all of that becomes additive, and you can see different things in different people with that. So some people may express that as, diseases such as heart disease and hypertension, and then that impacts the brain, because we know that increases the risk of what? Of strokes, right? So hypertension increases the risk of stroke. People with heart disease have a higher risk of stroke as well, because it's making all of those changes. So the brain has vasculature as well, and stress increases inflammation, and inflammation increases the chances of damaging the vasculature everywhere, not just in the heart, but in the brain as well. So you're thinking all of that can really contribute to increasing our risk of numerous things. And so ultimately, when we're saying that stress changes the brain, and how does that present and how does that look? It looks different for different people, right? It looks different. For some people, it's unrelenting anxiety. For some people, it's just a depression that's really, really difficult to treat. For some people, it's early onset dementia. For some people, it's having increased risk of things like strokes because high blood pressure is now present, or the habits that you've developed to help you get through the stress is contributing to other things like increasing your risk for stroke. So it's all of that. It looks different. And it's you want your brain. The one thing I know for sure as I get older is I want my brain to be as healthy as possible. So while I of course I want my body to be as healthy as possible as well, and they're interconnected. I mean, you can't remove your head and have the body. It doesn't work like that. So I want to be able to think clearly. And so when we hear that older people, it's like we don't do this as well. We don't just well, all of that requires that we exercise our brain, and stress can really interfere with that. So it's so important that we start thinking. We know about heart health, and we're all about it, and a lot of things that we do for heart health helps the brain. So we have to start thinking of brain health as well.
So let's unpack some things that you said, because I don't want people to miss this. And ladies, when we talk about silent stressors, one of the things you talked about, heart health. So the stress, stress that puts the stress on your heart. But there's also other things that, from a work perspective, a number of other things that kind of create kind of that silent stressor. You talked about another one related to mental health, and I want to break that apart a little bit, because there's a stress of just the everyday dealing with the weight of being that person, right? And so a lot of us are that person to everyone. And so you have to recognize that, and you talked a little bit about that when you just spoke, recognizing that you can't be everything to everyone, and at some point the string, the branch, whatever, will break, right? You can't continue kind of down that road of pushing. One of the other things that you talked about was, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, but compound the lack of sleep with also diet. And there's a part, and can you just explain a little bit more about how the effect of both of those end up becoming a silent stressor and people don't realize?
Well, there are different stressors, right? So many of us, when we think stress, we think psychological, emotional, and all that's important as well. But then there are physical things that we can do that put stressors on the body and ask the body to do more than it's capable of doing. So lack of sleep definitely does that, because when we don't sleep, there's no chance for the body to rejuvenate. There's no chance for the brain to sort of clear out all of the toxins, which is one of the things that it does do when we sleep. There's a nice little study that shows the brain almost literally does a deep cleaning each night when we sleep and kind of clears everything out. So there's no chance for the brain to do that. So you're adding physical stressors. And a lot of times the truth is, when we become stressed, we develop habits that are really not supportive to coping well with that stress. And so we might find ourselves not sleeping well, right? And so we might find ourselves taking up habits that are really not that great. So we might find ourselves maybe even drinking a little bit more than we should. We might find ourselves doing is like, I'm so stressed, I don't feel like exercising or getting out or just being one with nature. I'm too overwhelmed to do any of those things. But it is in those moments of overwhelm, it's exactly in those moments when you need to do things to release some of that stress and anxiety. So when you add to that a diet that's not nutrient supportive to you. So when we get stressed, we don't think, gee, what should I eat to like really support my body during this time? No, what we tend to do is we reach for things that are easy to eat, easy to digest. And what tends to happen is that tends to be sweeter things and more processed things because they're more easily portable, et cetera, et cetera. And we tend to then start consuming a lot of that because now we're eating unconsciously. And when we eat unconsciously, not only are we not aware of how much and what we are eating, we tend to choose things that don't have a lot of nutrients. So So stress that's not treated and not acknowledged, and we don't develop coping mechanisms for, we develop habits around it that are really more detrimental to us. So part of the negative impact of stress, besides having the body flooded with all of the hormonal chaos, part of the negative impact of stress is that the habits we develop around it, the habits we develop to cope with it. How many of us are stress eaters? How many of us, when we become overwhelmed, we become more sedentary?
Yes. Yes.
I mean, all of this. So we just develop habits that just really compound the problem. So this is why we have to really be conscious about developing coping mechanisms. And my opinion is we need to start teaching this in schools. That is my opinion. We need to start when we are younger. Just like we need to know how to count and our money and how to speak and put a sentence together and all of these other things. This is a fundamental thing, people. This is fundamental to health. 75 to 80% of doctors' visits are secondary to stress. This is fundamental. Our children are out there right now with huge anxiety levels. They have no idea how to cope with. And they have parents who cannot teach them because they don't know either. So this is really, really fundamental. We must pay attention to this because there's so many things that right now we're in the middle of some chaotic times, right? It would have been nice if we had developed some coping mechanisms prior to this. That would have been nice. But here we are now, and we're going, okay, what am I going to do to cope?
Right.
The middle of chaos. This is the point where my mom always says, you got to dig your well before you're thirsty.
Right.
This is the part where she was talking about.
I know you can't give us a definitive rate, but if you had to pick a percentage, what is the percentage of women to men do you think women actually, to your point, have a bigger issue with some of the things that we're talking about today, the stressors and not being able to necessarily cope? They think that they're being effective, but it's not healthy the way that they're doing it.
Well, the thing is, men and women in the studies, they do things like a little bit differently. They respond to stressors a little bit differently. Like women in stressful jobs, they do better if they have a sound family support system. They tend not to express like negative impact of stress. While men, it doesn't matter because they're like jobs in job situation, when they get stressed out, that's where they find most of their stressors. Women also tend to take on the role of taking care of everybody else's, not only physical needs, their emotional needs and all of their needs. And they feel oftentimes is their job to make the world run smoother and everybody be happier in their family. And they don't want to rock the boat with this. And so they start internalizing a lot of things as well. So that's the additional structure that happens with that. I'm not saying it doesn't happen to men, but I'm just saying that I tend to notice it more with women.
Wow. You gave probably one of the best visuals that I have ever heard. And you talked about the cleaning out of your brain while you're sleeping. And I just had a visual of someone coming into the office, dumping out all the trash cans, wiping everything down, and what that would look like if someone did not do that. Within a 2-week period. So I just wanted to mention that because you always give these gems. Sometimes I don't think you realize it either, that I think are critical for people to really put the image with the action. And that's one of those that I did not want us to miss. So we are at time once again, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity to give one more key nugget about just the stress and brain health and how women, if they really want to age gracefully, how they can take some immediate steps to get there.
Absolutely. So the important thing, again, is to develop some beneficial coping mechanisms. And part of that is start focusing on the things that you can control. As women, we tend to want to control everything. And we get really distraught that we can't, which is not realistic because we can't. So we really need to start focusing on the things that that we can control and make it a priority, people. Like every day you get up, you brush your teeth, your breakfast, you shower, you've put time in your day for all of that. Stress management needs to be in there. Like it should be on your calendar between 10 a.m. and 10:20. This is my time to decompress. So it needs to be part of your routine. It's not the first thing to go when things get crazy. It should always be there, and it should be the first thing that you implement when things get crazy. Because when things get crazy, that is when you need to think as clearly as possible.
Yeah.
So without that whole keeping the brain healthy and making sure that you schedule that time in there, when thing gets nuts, it's only going to become more chaotic. So if I had one little nugget, schedule it like you schedule everything else.
Schedule it. And scheduling those standard stretch breaks too. I think you said this one a previous, even standing against the wall, taking a deep breath, all great insight. And so we're at that time again. Guys, if you would like to connect with Dr. Harry one-on-one, she has a Facebook group that is open until after Labor Day. It is called Be Iconic, Accountability Partners, a team of individuals that are just there trying to make it through the same challenges you're making it through. And then also you get tips and tricks from the doctor on call, Dr. Harry. So please reach out, join that Facebook group. Also, if you would like to schedule an appointment with Dr. Harry in this time of telehealth, it's at www.drharry.com.